Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at John chapter 2, verses 12 through 25, where we read of the cleansing of the temple. In the previous section, we had seen Jesus going to a wedding. This is John chapter 2, verses 1 through 11. It was at Cana of Galilee. He turned the water into wine. It was his first miracle, and it had been seen by the servants and by implication also by the disciples because we read that they believed. Then there was that transitional verse, verse 12, where he goes and he sojourns for a short time in the village of Capernaum. That's on the Sea of Galilee. The word actually Capernaum, the term kaper in Hebrew is village. And so village of Nahum, or we could say village of comfort, because that's what the name Nahum means. And so he's there for a short time. Now, as we open up in verse 13, he's going to be going to the Passover celebration. It will be down in Jerusalem, not in Galilee, but down to the south in Judea, in Jerusalem. And he will get there. We're going to see him cleansing the temple, and he will be challenged in that action by the Jewish authorities. It's interesting in the wedding of at Galilee. There's not really a challenge, but there's maybe a little bit of a verbal confrontation, not with Jesus, but with the steward of the wedding who goes to the bridegroom. Here, they're going to actually go to Jesus. And we'll also see at the latter end of that chapter, he's going to be doing other miracles. So he'd done his first miracle at Cana, but now we're going to see other miracles as well. Verse 13, then, the Passover of the Jews was near, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. So he's in Galilee, and notice he's going south. You say, isn't that down? No, Jerusalem's always uphill because it's actually up in the mountains. And so traditionally, if you were Jewish and you were making that trip to Jerusalem, you would actually go up or guess I should say down. You would follow the route of the Jordan River to bypass the land of Samaria. We're going to see more of this when we come to chapter 4. And then from there, you'd get to Jericho, and then you'd go literally uphill all the way up to Jerusalem. And so Jesus goes there. Now, the synoptic gospels are going to have the description of Jesus and his disciples cleansing the temple. And here we don't read his disciples doing it, but Jesus is cleansing the temple. In the synoptics, it is placed in Matthew, Mark, and Luke at the end of the ministry of Jesus. Here in John chapter 2, we're really at the beginning of the ministry of Jesus. So which is it? Is it the end or is it at the beginning? In the Synoptic Gospels, there's no scourge mentioned. Here we're going to read that he fashions and uses a scourge of cords to accomplish this. In the Synoptic Gospels, there's no mention made of the zeal of Jesus. Here in the Gospel of John, we're going to read where the disciples remember a prophecy of the Messiah's zeal for the house of the Lord, and they're going to connect his action with the Hebrew Scriptures, with the Old Testament Scriptures. Now, at the beginning of and end of the life of Jesus, and you ask, well, which was it? Was it at the beginning or was it the end? It might have been at both. The reason I say this is because at the beginning and the end of his life and ministry, Jesus comes to Jerusalem for the Passover. There in John chapter 2, in fact, John's going to record a number of trips to Jerusalem. This is the first one that John records, but he'll speak of other times Jesus comes to Jerusalem for the Passover, and then once in John 5 for a feast that he doesn't actually identify which feast it is. There are a number of times where I think perhaps there's a number of times where he cleanses the temple, both at the beginning of his ministry, as described here in John chapter 2, but also at the end of his ministry, described in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. There are a number of times, think about this, where he serves wine. Um, there's a number of times he served, when you say serves wine, at the Lord's Supper, but also at the wedding feast. There are a number of times where he's met by a cast of characters that include two different Simons. We're going to see different times where he meets somebody named Simon, Simon Peter, but also Simon somebody else, where there are several different people by the name of Mary that come and interact with him. Think about all the different Marys there are in the New Testament, where there will be two different Herods, and they will be called Herod, but you have Herod the Great in Matthew chapter 2. But there's also Herod Antipas that we're going to see toward the end of actually during the ministry of Jesus. And also, think about this, two different Josephs, where in Matthew chapter 2, there was Joseph, his father, adopted father, but then there's going to be a Joseph of Arimathea. He's not the same person. He's a different Joseph. So just because, two different things happen or different names are used, the same name is used, doesn't mean it's necessarily the same person. Now, he's coming here for Passover, and you have to remember the significance of the Passover event. Remember that it looks back to the freeing of the Israelites from Egypt, way back in Exodus. God had given 10 plagues, and then the 10th of those plagues had been that the firstborn of every firstborn of Egypt, in the land of Egypt, whether it was Egyptian, whether it was Israelite, whether it was man or animal, every firstborn was going to die. Unless, so they were all under the sentence of death, but there was a provision of life. There was a possibility to escape that death when the angel of death passed over. If you took a lamb and you sacrificed it and then took its blood, you were supposed to eat the lamb, but then collect its blood, and you were to place it over the lintel on the two doorposts and on the lintel. You were to apply the blood to the door, and whatever house, whether it was an Israelite house or an Egyptian house, um, whoever was the firstborn, whether man or animal, whether Israelite, Egyptian, or animal, the firstborn would not die. Otherwise, they were under the sentence of death. Otherwise, they would die. But they would not die if the blood had been applied. Now, we're told in 1 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 7 that Christ, our Passover, also has been sacrificed, so that there is a sense in which the Passover had a future fulfillment that was fulfilled in the person of Jesus. It's no accident that when the time comes for his death upon the cross, he will be crucified at the time of the Passover. The Passover will be about to take place, and he will be crucified in that season. So they've come to Passover, verse 14, and he, that is Jesus, found in the temple those who were selling oxen and sheep and doves and the money changers seated. And notice our translators added the phrase at their tables. I think that's the idea that's being given. Notice this takes place in the temple, but there's two different Greek words that are used for temple. This is iron. Um, Hieron, here's the English spelling of it. Remember that word hieroglyphs? Speaking of the holy writings of Egypt, they were sort of used for special occasions. You didn't write hieroglyphs when you were just writing a letter. It wasn't used for everyday sorts of things. And so the temple is a holy place, and that works here. It's a Greek word. But when it's used in the New Testament, it refers not just to the temple building in particular, but to all of the outer courts as well. And so I don't think Jesus went into the temple, the actual holy place or the Holy of Holies. No, they weren't. They wouldn't have been buying and selling in those parts. This seems to be referring to one of the outer courts where this is taking place. Now, let's look at a model of the city of Jerusalem, and specifically the temple complex. You see the temple building right in the middle of our photo, but then surrounding it, both immediately around and also in these outer areas, there are large courts. And surrounding the inner court, we had a wall. You can only see the part on the right and left, but it surrounded that entire area. There was a wall that surrounded those entire section of inner courts, and it was called the dividing wall. It was about 4 feet high. It had gates every so often, and at those gates were signs that said, and they were written in both Greek and Latin. Just in case you couldn't, if you were Hebrew, you probably knew better. But if you didn't speak Hebrew, and we found the Greek ones. I've actually seen some of those. These signs that said, "No Gentile past this point upon pain of death." But supposedly it was written in Greek as well as in Latin. And on the outside of these courts, outside those walls, still within the courtyard of the temple. This was known as the court of the Gentiles, and what that meant is that Gentiles were allowed to come here. Now they still had to behave themselves; they still had to be, quiet and respectful, but they were allowed into that outer court area. So here again, you can see the outer wall, that dividing wall. You can see the small gates every so often, where there would be a gate leading through those into those inner courts, and the outer courts, that court of the Gentile. This evidently this was the place. Now, perhaps not. Some people have thought maybe it was to the south of the Temple Mount, and I suppose that's possible. But most scholars think that it was this court of the Gentiles, which means the place that the Gentiles could come to worship. Those were being sort of used and abused by this buying and selling. Another picture of what that would have looked like. You have to get an idea of the scope. And in the distance, you can see the dividing wall and then the temple complex behind that. Well, notice verse 15, he made a scourge of cords and drove them all out of the temple with the sheep and the oxen. Now, notice there's sheep and oxen. You say, why would there be sheep and oxen there? Well, these are for the sacrifices. And they had to be ceremonially pure. And by having them available for purchase, you see, you could bring your own sheep and your own oxen, but it would be examined and it might be rejected. Maybe for good reason. I don't know. Maybe just because it wasn't part of the official temple flock. So if you wanted to be careful, you'd buy your sheep and your oxen there in the temple. And also notice he poured out the coins of the money changers. And here you do have a reference, and overturned their tables. Um, so the sheep and the oxen, they were there for sacrifices. The money changers, you could only offer certain types of money in the temple. It was not an equal opportunity money benefactor. So once you went into the temple, or if you were a Gentile, you weren't allowed to go that far, but you could make an offering of coins, but you could only use either the Jewish coins. Although it's interesting that they would also, there was one particular Phoenician shekel that they would accept. And I think that's sort of odd. But they would accept those, and if you came with any other money, you would have to get it changed. Just like when you go to a foreign country, you have to change the money, usually for a markup. You're going to pay a little bit of an extra price, and the money changers would charge an extra fee. I'm not sure if it was reasonable or not, but they would charge their extra fee, which meant that they were here. They were here to change money, but they were also here to make money. And so notice both the sheep and the oxen and the money changers, and those who were selling doves. That was the poor man's sacrifice, but that you didn't get off cheaply there either. So this was part of the money making operation that had set up in this outer court of the temple. And Jesus says to them, take these things away. Stop making my Father's house a place of business. So this is the issue. This had become sort of business as usual. And he doesn't mention the fact that it was the place of the Gentiles. You think the Gentiles, this is the only place they could come to worship. Um, and it's almost as though the Jewish presence looked down on the Gentiles. They didn't take those things into their own area of worship, but they did set them up in what would have been the Gentile place of worship. If I'm correct in that the setting for this was the court of the Gentiles and not one of the outer places outside the temple complex. I think that's probably the case. Verse 17, his disciples remembered that it was written, zeal for your house will consume me. Now, you're remembering after the fact. Once the death, burial, and resurrection takes place, they're going to remember that Psalm chapter 69, verse 6 is quoted here, where it looks, that the zeal that Jesus has for the house. When we get to the trials of Jesus, one of the charges are going to be what happened here, and also some of the things that he's about to say about the temple. Let's continue. Verse 18, the Jews then said to him, what sign do you show us as your authority for doing these things. So they're asking for a sign. And he has already given a miracle. The word for miracle is the same word for sign, the same term. Um, in verse 11, we saw this beginning of his signs, his miracles, Jesus did in Cana of Galilee and manifested his glory, and his disciples believed in him. So he had already done a miracle, a sign up in Galilee, but now they're asking for a sign down here. I don't know if they're thinking miracle yet. I'm not sure that they knew that he could do miracles, but they're asking, where's your authority? Who gave you the right to do this? Verse 19, Jesus answered them, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Now remember, he's standing in the courtyard that surrounds the entire temple complex. By the way, when he says destroy this temple, he uses a different word. Instead of hieron, it's the Greek word naos. There's the English transliteration of it, and this refers to the temple itself, and we could render it the sanctuary. So this is the actual temple building. But when Jesus says that, he's not referencing the temple building. I can see where they thought that he was, because that's the area where he was. But we're going to have an explanation that John the writer gives us that explains the words of Jesus. You see, if we hadn't had that, then there would likely be two schools of thought. There'd be one that says, well, Jesus is he's not speaking of the literal temple, he's speaking figuratively. And there might be others that would say, oh no, yeah, that's where he was. Always interpret the Bible literally. And they would have said there's going to be a time when Jesus destroys the actual physical temple in Jerusalem and it's going to be raised up. Well, fortunately, we don't have to have that argument because John the writer explains it in the next verse. Verse 20, the Jews, or two verses away, the Jews then said it took 46 years to build this temple. And will you raise it up in 3 days? They're thinking, they're hearing his words, they're assuming he is referring to the literal temple. By the way, notice it's possible for the hearers to assume a literal interpretation and Jesus to be meaning something else entirely. So they said, look, this took place 46 years. We know from Josephus that the work had been started in the year 20 BC. It was still going on, but 46 years, you do the math, and that means that by this time it was around 27 AD. You say, well, why not 26? There's no year zero, so you go from 1 BC to 1 AD. It'd been 46 years, and it was still underway. I mean, the temple itself was finished, but there was still construction work going on. And so they asked him, and you're going to raise it up in 3 days? They find that just a silly statement to make. It would be completed, by the way, 64 AD, just in time for it to be destroyed a few years later. Verse 21, but he was speaking of the temple of his body. So John explains that this was not, the literal physical temple there in Jerusalem, but he was given a prophecy about how he would die. The temple of his body would be buried, and then he would rise again on the third day. Verse 22, so when he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered this. This tells me two things. One, that prophecy is easier to understand after it's been fulfilled. And why does he call it a temple? Because a temple is a structure. A temple is a structure where God resides. And the body of Jesus was a temple. By the way, that holds true in a different sense for us. There's a sense in which we are also called in the epistles that your body serves as a temple of God, both collectively, the entire church, but also individually. If you have come to Christ, the Holy Spirit has moved in, taken up residence within you, and your body has become a temple because God is residing there. Now, not the same way Jesus was, but still, there's a sense in who he was, we share now because we've been connected to him. Notice his disciples remembered that he said this, and they believed. Notice the two things they believed. They believed the scripture, and the word which Jesus had spoken. They put it all together. They put the scripture and the word and saw how he fulfilled it all. Now, I want you to notice the connection between these two sections. We'd had Cana of Galilee, now we're in Jerusalem of Judea. We saw a wedding feast, now we're looking at a Passover feast. We saw in the previous section the problem, no wine. Now the problem is no reverence for the house of God. We saw back in that first section there were jars of water that were for the purpose of ceremonial cleansing. Now we see that the temple is a place where ceremonial cleansing took place. The lambs, the coin. There was actually a washing that would take place before you would go into the temple. You would stop at one of the pools of water. They were called mikvahs, and you would wash, and then you would go in and worship. In the first part of the chapter, we saw Jesus turning the water into wine. Now we see him overturning tables. In the first section, we read that Jesus said his hour had not yet come, but now he alludes to the temple being destroyed and rising again. That's when his hour would come. So indirectly, he speaks of that here in John chapter 2, verses 12 through 22. In the previous section, John showed how Jesus is the water. Jesus is the water turned into wine when his hour comes. Um, he is that which we drink. Now we see that he is the temple who will be destroyed and raised up again, so that both of these narratives emphasize the true identity of Jesus. And the point is that you were to see who Jesus is and you were to believe him. He is to be believed. They believed on him, and you were to do so as well. Now, before we finish, we're going to look two more verses. Verse 23. Now, when he was in Jerusalem at the Passover during the feast, many believed. And you see how we talked about how you're to believe also? Well, that belief theme is going to continue through the end of the chapter and into the next chapter. So many believed in his name, observing his signs. So he was doing signs, which he was doing. Verse 24, but Jesus, on his part, was not entrusting himself to them. Now, when we talked about believing, they were believing in him. In English, we have two different words. We have believe and we have trust. In Greek, it's all the same word. So if we could just translate it that way, on Jesus on his part was not believing himself to them. That's bad English, but good Greek. So they're believing in him, but he's not believing in them. Why? For he knew all men, and because he did not need anyone to testify concerning men, for he himself knew what was in man, that man is not, can I say it this way? Man is not trustworthy. But, and this is going to take us into the next section, so we'll look at these verses again next time. But there was a man to whom he is going to entrust himself just a bit, and that man's going to be named Nicodemus. But we'll see him next time.